had been on the force for nearly a decade when this incident happened. It was supposed to be an ordinary shift, one of those quiet nights when the most action you expect is breaking up a bar fight or helping a stranded motorist. The late fall air was crisp, and the moon hung low, casting long shadows across the deserted highway. I was driving my patrol car from one small city to another, the kind of stretch where the only company is the occasional semi-truck or an overeager deer crossing the road. The road was flanked by thick woods, their skeletal branches swaying gently in the cold breeze. It was about 1 a.m. when I spotted a car parked on the shoulder, its hazard lights flickering like a heartbeat in the darkness. Something about the scene made me uneasy. Maybe it was the way the car's front end dipped slightly, indicating a flat tire, or perhaps it was the isolated stretch of road that made it feel eerily vulnerable. I decided to stop and check it out. I slowed to a stop behind the car, activating my own lights for safety. As I stepped out, the cold night air bit into me, a sharp contrast to the warmth of the cruiser. My boots crunched against the gravel shoulder as I approached. A man, mid-40s at least, wearing a dark jacket and jeans, stood by the car. He looked up as I approached, offering a tight, forced smile. His movements were stiff, his eyes darting nervously toward the car, where a young woman sat in the passenger seat. She couldn't have been more than 20, her pale face partially obscured by long, dark hair. Even in the dim light, I could see her hands trembling as they clutched the edge of the seat. I gestured toward the flat tire. "Need a hand?" I asked, keeping my tone casual but attentive. The man nodded, his movements too quick, too eager. Something about the way he answered felt off, like a note played out of tune. He avoided eye contact, his attention shifting between me and the girl, who was now staring at me with wide, tear-filled eyes. At first, I thought her fear was due to the flat tire or the inconvenience of being stranded in the middle of nowhere. But the longer I stood there, the more I realized it was something deeper, something primal. The man fumbled with words, trying to explain how the tire had gone flat and how they'd been stuck for a while. His story was fragmented, inconsistent. My gut told me to dig deeper. I leaned slightly to get a better look at the girl. Her lip quivered, and she seemed on the verge of speaking but didn't. Instead, she glanced at the man, a fleeting look that screamed fear. "You okay, miss?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. Her eyes darted to the man again, and then she nodded. A quick, mechanical motion that didn't convince me in the slightest. That's when he shifted. His stance became rigid, his hand moving toward his jacket pocket in a way that set every nerve in my body on edge. I'd seen this before, that subtle change in posture, the way a predator's muscles tense before striking. My hand instinctively hovered near my holster as I stepped back, giving myself room to react. "Stay right there," I said firmly, but it was too late. In one swift motion, he pulled a gun and aimed it at me and then at the girl. My heart thundered in my chest as adrenaline surged. He shouted something, his voice trembling but loud enough to echo into the woods. The girl started sobbing, her hands clutching at the door as if she wanted to bolt but couldn't. I drew my weapon, aiming at him while trying to keep calm. Years of training kicked in, but nothing prepares you for the raw terror of staring down the barrel of a gun in the middle of nowhere. The world seemed to narrow, the only sounds the girl's muffled cries and the man's erratic breathing. "Put it down," I ordered, but his hand only tightened on the grip. And then, before I could react further, he fired. The sound shattered the silence, a deafening crack that seemed to freeze time. A searing pain shot through my side, like a hot knife carving into my flesh. I staggered back, clutching at the wound as my vision blurred. The man turned and bolted toward the woods, disappearing into the darkness with the kind of speed born of desperation. The girl scrambled out of the car, rushing to my side. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold my phone as I instructed her to call for backup and an ambulance. My uniform was damp with warmth, the sensation stark against the freezing night. Every breath felt like fire, but I stayed conscious, clinging to the sound of her voice as she spoke to the dispatcher. She stayed by my side, her terror giving way to a determined calm. It was as if helping me gave her some semblance of control over the chaos. Within minutes that felt like hours, the wail of sirens broke through the stillness. Officers and paramedics arrived, their faces blurs of concern and focus. They tended to me quickly, stabilizing me before loading me into the ambulance. I caught a glimpse of the girl, wrapped in a blanket and speaking to another officer, her face a mixture of relief and lingering fear. Later, I learned the man had been found hiding in the woods about 2 hours after the incident. He tried to cover his tracks but had left too many clues behind. The girl's story confirmed what I'd suspected. He'd abducted her earlier that evening, and the flat tire had been a cruel twist of fate that ultimately saved her life. The wound I'd sustained wasn't life-threatening, though it took months to fully recover. Physically, I healed, but the memory of that night, the look in the girl's eyes, and the haunting realization of how close we both came to losing our lives stayed with me. It's the kind of story that reminds you why you put on the badge every day, despite the risks. Because sometimes, you're the only thing standing between someone and the darkness. If you're here for the first time, make sure to subscribe to our channel and tap the bell icon so you never miss a terrifying story. Your support means so much to us. Be sure to share these eerie tales with your friends and family. Thank you for being part of our community. Now, let's jump into the next story. February 5th, 2020, started like any other night on patrol. The streets were quiet, the air heavy with the kind of damp cold that seeped through your coat and into your bones. I remember it vividly because the weather was unusual for that time of year. Foggy, with a fine mist clinging to everything like a second skin. My shift started at 10 p.m., and by midnight, I had already settled into the routine of scanning for speeders and checking on the usual trouble spots. Around 12:45 a.m., the radio crackled to life. Unit 47, respond to a 10 to 90 at 343 Elmwood Drive. Caller reports suspicious activity. It was my turn to cover that sector, so I acknowledged the call and made my way there. Elmwood Drive was a long, winding road on the outskirts of town, lined with old houses that seemed to sag under the weight of their history. Most of the homes were abandoned, their windows boarded up and their yards overgrown with weeds. When I arrived, the street was eerily silent, the mist swirling around my cruiser's headlights like ghostly tendrils. The house at 343 Elmwood was one of the few that looked lived in. A single porch light flickered weakly, and the silhouette of a large oak tree loomed over the property, its gnarled branches clawing at the foggy sky. I stepped out of my car, the crunch of gravel under my boots sounding unnaturally loud. As I approached the house, I noticed the curtains in the front window twitch, as if someone had been watching me. My hand instinctively rested on my holstered weapon. I knocked on the door, the sound echoing through the stillness. After a moment, a man opened the door. He was middle-aged, with disheveled hair and a worn flannel shirt. His eyes were wide and darting, like a trapped animal's. "Officer, thank God you're here," he said, his voice trembling. There's someone in the basement." "Someone in the basement?" I repeated, trying to keep my tone calm. "Do you know who it is?" He shook his head violently. "No, but I hear them. Footsteps. Whispering. It's been going on for hours. I'm too scared to go down there." I glanced past him into the house. The living room was dimly lit, cluttered with old furniture and stacks of newspapers. It smelled faintly of mildew and something metallic, like blood. "Stay here," I instructed. "I'll check it out." He nodded, retreating into the shadows of the hallway as I stepped inside. The floorboards creaked under my weight, each step amplifying my unease. The entrance to the basement was a narrow door at the end of the hall. It was slightly ajar, revealing a wooden staircase descending into darkness. I drew my flashlight and unholstered my weapon. The beam of light cut through the blackness, illuminating the steep stairs and the concrete walls below. As I descended, the air grew colder, heavier, carrying with it a faint, sickly sweet odor that made my stomach churn. Halfway down, I heard it. A faint whispering, too low to make out words but unmistakably human. My pulse quickened, and I gripped my weapon tighter. "This is the police. Come out with your hands up," I called, my voice firm despite the knot of fear tightening in my chest. The whispering stopped. For a moment, the silence was deafening, pressing in on me like the walls themselves were closing in. Then, a sound, a soft shuffling, like bare feet on concrete, came from the far corner of the basement. I swung the flashlight toward the sound, and that's when I saw it. A figure stood just outside the beam of light, partially obscured by the shadows. It was tall, impossibly tall, with elongated limbs that seemed to stretch unnaturally. Its head was tilted at an angle that no human neck could achieve, and its eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the light like an animal's in the dark. "Stay where you are," commanded, my voice shaking now. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, staring, its breath visible in the cold air, rising and falling in uneven bursts. I took a cautious step forward, my flashlight trembling in my grip. The beam briefly flickered, and when it steadied, the figure was gone. Just gone. My heart was pounding as I scanned the basement, searching for any sign of the intruder. The room was empty save for an old boiler and some scattered tools. But the smell of decay was stronger now, so overpowering that I gagged. And then I heard it, a voice, faint and distorted, whispering directly into my ear. "You shouldn't have come." I spun around, my flashlight sweeping the empty space behind me. There was no one there. Panic surged through me as I backed toward the stairs, my weapon drawn and my every instinct screaming to get out. As I reached the top of the staircase, the basement door slammed shut with a force that rattled the entire house. I threw my shoulder against it, desperate to escape, and it flew open. I stumbled into the hallway, gasping for air, only to find the homeowner staring at me with a strange, detached expression. "Did you find them?" he asked, his voice eerily calm. I didn't answer. I just bolted for the front door, my heart racing. When I reached my cruiser, I radioed for backup, my hands trembling so badly I could barely hold the mic. When my colleagues arrived, we searched the house from top to bottom. The basement was empty, and the homeowner, he was gone, vanished without a trace. Even his car was still in the driveway. To this day, I can't explain what happened that night. All I know is that something not of this world was in that house. And every time I close my eyes, I see those glowing eyes staring back at me, waiting, watching. February 5th, 2020, is a night I'll never forget. And I hope to God I never encounter whatever that was again. The night was uncommonly cold for early spring, and the air hung heavy with the scent of rain that hadn't yet fallen. It was the kind of evening that made everything feel a little off, like the world itself was holding its breath. My shift had been uneventful until then. A few noise complaints, a routine traffic stop, nothing out of the ordinary. I was just settling into the monotony of it when the call came through. A woman had reported screaming from her neighbor's house, a place that had been vacant for years. I knew the house. Every officer in the precinct did. The locals called it the Larson place, and it was the stuff of small-town legends. The family had disappeared without a trace decades ago, leaving the house to rot, its paint peeling like dead skin. Kids dared each other to touch the front door, and nobody stayed on the block past sunset unless they had to. When I pulled up, the house loomed against the dark sky like a skeleton wrapped in shadows. The streetlights barely touched it, their glow diffused by the mist that clung to everything. The wind had picked up, carrying with it the faintest echo of something unnatural, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I radioed in my location and approached the house, flashlight in one hand, the other hovering near my holster. The front door was slightly ajar, swaying gently as if beckoning me in. I hesitated, but the scream, shrill and piercing, came again, and this time it was unmistakably human. Steeling myself, I pushed the door open, the hinges groaning like an animal in pain. Inside, the air was thick and stagnant, as though the house itself was holding on to every breath that had ever passed through it. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating a scene of decay. The wallpaper hung in tatters, streaked with something that looked too dark to be just dirt. The furniture was overturned, as if someone had left in a hurry, and the floor was covered in a layer of dust so thick it muffled my footsteps. But the thing that struck me most was the silence. It was so profound it felt alive, pressing against me, waiting. I followed the sound of the scream to the staircase. The wooden steps were narrow and uneven, each one protesting under my weight. The air grew colder the higher I climbed, a biting chill that seemed to seep into my bones. At the top of the stairs, the hallway stretched out before me, the doors on either side like gaping mouths. I moved toward the source of the noise, a room at the end of the hall where the door was slightly ajar. The faintest light flickered from within, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. I pushed the door open with the tip of my flashlight, and what I saw stopped me cold. The room was empty save for a single chair in the center, and on that chair sat a doll. It wasn't just any doll. It was old, its porcelain face cracked, its glass eyes staring unblinking at the door. Its dress was tattered and stained, and around its neck hung a string of small, worn teeth. My stomach churned as I stepped closer. That's when I noticed the writing on the walls, scrawled in what looked like blood. It said, "She's waiting." The scream came again, louder this time, but it wasn't coming from the room. It was behind me. I spun around, heart pounding, but the hallway was empty. The silence rushed back in, heavier now, suffocating. I tried to radio for backup, but the signal was dead. My flashlight flickered, and for a moment, I was plunged into darkness. When the beam steadied, I caught movement at the edge of the light. A figure, tall and gaunt, stood at the other end of the hallway. Its face was obscured, but its eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the light like an animal's. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, but I felt its gaze bore into me, dissecting me, unmaking me. My hand went to my weapon, but when I blinked, the figure was gone. I don't remember descending the stairs. One moment I was frozen in that hallway, and the next I was outside, gasping for air as rain began to fall in sheets. My car was parked where I'd left it, but something was wrong. The windows were fogged from the inside, and the silhouette of a person sat in the driver's seat. My heart raced as I approached, weapon drawn. The door was unlocked, and when I swung it open, the seat was empty. But written on the fogged windshield, in the same scrawling hand as the writing on the wall, were the words, "She's still waiting." I left without looking back, and I didn't stop driving until I was miles away from that cursed place. The house was investigated the next day, but they found nothing. No doll, no writing, no sign that anyone had been there. They chalked it up to stress and overactive imagination, maybe even a prank. But I know what I saw, I know what I heard, and I know she's still waiting.